Welcome to the Theology Made Podcast. I'm Jordan. In today's episode, we're going to look at whether Darwin killed God. In 1859, Charles Darwin published a book that supposedly ended something. God. At least that's the story we're told in church. Science went to war with religion, Darwin fired the first shot, and faith, unable to survive the evidence, retreated into superstition. Super dramatic, but also almost entirely wrong. Let's start with the famous image. It's 1860, Oxford, England. 1 year after the On the Origin of Species is published. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce stands up to debate Thomas Henry Huxley. That was Darwin's bulldog, if you will, as they called him. And according to legend, Wilberforce mockingly asked whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side. Huxley supposedly fired back that he'd rather be descended from an ape than from a bishop who uses his gifts to suppress truth. The crowd erupts. Faith loses, science wins. And there's just one tiny little problem. A footnote, if you will. The debate did happen, but that famous ape-ancestor exchange is very poorly documented and likely embellished by later retellings. The first accounts of it appeared decades later, so the story was retold, embellished, and eventually calcified into mythology. The story became the founding moment of what historians call the conflict thesis, the idea that science and religion are locked in an eternal war. But that was largely invented. The conflict thesis was popularized in two books, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science by John William Draper in 1874, and A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology by Andrew Dickinson White in 1896. Both were not written as neutral history, but they were polemics, which just means arguments, and both have since been largely discredited by historians of science. Peter Harrison, one of the leading historians in this field, has called the warfare model a Victorian invention. Most serious scholars of science and religion reject it outright. But the myth lives on, because myths are useful. They tell us who the heroes are and who the villains are, and we like our story simple. But here's what the myth requires you to forget. People like Gregor Mendel, the man who discovered genetics, the very science that would later explain how natural selection actually works. He was an Augustinian friar. He was a monk. He did his experiments in a quiet monastery garden. Or Georges Lumet, the physicist who first proposed what we now call the Big Bang, the origin of the universe. He was a Catholic priest. And when Einstein first heard his theory, Einstein told him his math was correct, but his physics was abominable. Lumet turned out to be right. The priest beat Einstein. Or how about Michael Faraday, one of the greatest experimental scientists in history? The man who discovered electromagnetic induction, who laid the foundation for every electric motor that exists today, was a deeply devout Christian. Or, in a more modern sense, Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, the mapping of the entire human genetic code, is a Christian. Far from being rare exceptions, religious scientists were common throughout the history of science and today. And even Darwin himself is complicated. He lost his faith, yes, but he called himself an agnostic, not an atheist. And significantly, he lost his faith largely not because of evolution, but because of the death of his daughter Annie at the age of 10. His crisis was just as much personal and emotional, if not more so, than just being purely scientific. So why does the conflict narrative still survive? And part of that reason is because it serves people. For a certain kind of atheist, it provides a creation myth. Science is the hero who slew the dragon of religion. The myth gives materialism a triumphant narrative arc. But some Christians have also fed into the myth too. When the church condemned Galileo in the 17th century, it handed the conflict narrative a genuine martyrdom story. And it was real. That happened. The church was wrong. Galileo was right. And the institution of the church chose politics and pride over truth. But even the Galileo case is more complicated than the myth admits. Galileo's problems with Rome were partly theological, partly political, partly personal. The Pope had been a friend of Galileo's until he felt publicly mocked by him. And Galileo himself was a committed Catholic who believed he was doing theology correctly, not attacking it. The myth also survives because of the Scopes trial, which we actually covered in a previous episode if you want to check that out. When fundamentalists in the 1920s tried to ban the teaching of evolution from public schools, they handed the conflict thesis a 20th century sequel. And that's the deeper point. When Christians respond to science with fear rather than curiosity, They just confirm the myth. They become the character the story needs them to be. Now here's the honest part. Darwin certainly challenged something, but maybe not what we think. He didn't disprove God, but he did challenge a particular argument for God. William Paley's famous watchmaker argument, published in 1802, 57 years before Darwin, said this: "If you found a watch on the ground, you'd conclude it had a designer." The same logic applies to living organisms. The eye, the wing, the cell, these are so complex and purposeful that they require a designer, therefore God. Darwin's natural selection offered a counter mechanism. Complexity, he showed, could arise without a conscious designer, through random variation and the pressure of survival over vast stretches of time. This was a genuine intellectual challenge. It didn't prove God didn't exist, but it meant you could no longer simply point at the complexity of life and say, see, there must be a God, without engaging the mechanisms Darwin had proposed. And that's important. Christians should take that seriously. But here's what's equally important. Disproving Paley's particular argument, it's not the same as disproving God. Philosophers have been arguing for centuries that the strongest case for theism was never the argument from biological design anyway. The cosmological argument, why is there something rather than nothing, isn't touched by Darwin at all. The moral argument, why do humans across all cultures share a deep sense of obligation and justice, isn't addressed by natural selection. The argument from consciousness, why the universe produces creatures who are aware of it, remains wide open. And there are many other facets as well. Darwin narrowed the argument, he didn't end it. What's interesting to me is how many serious Christian theologians in Darwin's own time, they didn't panic. Asa Gray, the leading American botanist and Darwin's chief advocate in the United States, was a devout Christian. He believed evolution was entirely compatible with faith, that natural selection was simply the mechanism by which God works in the biological world. B.B. Warfield, one of the architects of the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, a man that you would definitely not expect to be a fan of Darwin, wrote that he had no particular objection to the theory of evolution, that it was compatible with a high view of Scripture. The theologians who engaged Darwin carefully, rather than defensively, generally concluded that evolution changes how God creates, not whether God creates. The world is not a static thing God wound up and left alone. It's a dynamic, unfolding process, and there's a theological tradition stretching from Augustine through Aquinas, that God works through natural processes rather than around them. Augustine, writing in the 4th century, 1,500 years before Darwin, argued that Genesis should not be read as a precise account of the mechanics of creation. And he warned that Christians who insisted on a literal reading of Genesis and were then shown to be wrong by natural philosophers brought embarrassment on Scripture. He wrote that we should not be so attached to our interpretation of the text that we refuse to correct it when the evidence demands otherwise. Augustine in the 4th century was more prepared for Darwin than many Christians in the 21st century. So, did Darwin kill God? No. He killed a particular argument, perhaps, a particular way of reading Genesis, a comfortable certainty that the universe's complexity pointed so obviously to its maker that it needs no serious engagement. But I don't think that's a bad thing. Faith that can only survive in the absence of hard questions isn't faith, that's just avoidance. The Christian tradition, at its best, has always believed that truth cannot contradict truth, that good science and good theology, followed carefully to their conclusions, will eventually converge. Not because we force them, but because if God made the world, and studying the world is a form of reading what God wrote. The conflict is real in one sense. There are people for whom science has become a religion, an ideology that promises to answer questions it was never designed to answer. And there are Christians who've responded to scientific challenge with fear and defensiveness, and in doing so have made the conflict worse. But the war itself, the idea that science and faith are structurally opposed, that you must choose, that Darwin forced a decision, that's a myth. Whether you believe the earth is young or old, whether you believe evolution is true or not, is not the point. Because the most important thing you can do with a myth is know it for what it is and what it isn't. Thanks for listening to the Theology Made Podcast. If you found this helpful or encouraging, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on.